It's my great pleasure to have Professor Wendy Carlin from UCL with me today to speak about a number of important issues in macroeconomics and broadly in economics, and in particular teaching economics. So welcome, Wendy.
Thank you very much.
It's always a great pleasure to speak to Wendy in general, but in particular for the Economics Observatory website sort of endeavor, which I think shares many aims with something Wendy's been pushing very strongly of widening diversity and interest in economics. So I look forward to sort of adding this to the pile of material that can be used to kind of get more people interested in economics and a bit more literate in understanding the economics. So I'm going to start the questions taking us back to probably a time when, for many people, economics sort of jumped to the fore of their thinking, and that's the global financial crisis. Of course, that was a time when economics came to the fore because it was both the source of the problem in a way, given the sort of financial sector origins of the recession, but also, the policy responses were big, but also widely debated both at the time they were put in place and then the sort of responses after that. And I think it's fair to say that sentiment about economics and policy institutions generally took a hit, both in the UK and more widely at that time. So I'm going to come back to asking about this in more detail and the response of the profession. But the first question is really about now, because we're again in a time of crisis. The source is very different this time, but economic policy remains a kind of central part of the response. So how do you think policy has been doing in this time?
Well, I think one thing is to focus just a little bit on how different the crisis is, and think about what sort of a crisis it is, because that posed a challenge to us as economists, to policymakers as well. And maybe one way to think about it is to think of the network of ties between people through which the disease is transmitted. So that's the public health dimension of it. And then overlaid on that are the ties where face-to-face transactions have economic gains from trade. So we have this disease transmission network and we have this economic network. And the problem we face is that to control the public health dimension of the crisis, we have to cut the face-to-face ties that have economic value. So it's this interaction between the pandemic curve and the need for policymakers to impose a recession that, to flatten that pandemic curve, that's been a really unique feature of this crisis. We hadn't thought about that in a sense ever before. So it put everyone kind of on the spot to really dig deeply and figure out what's the nature of the shock and what should be the policy response.
It's very interesting you say that. I found myself saying words that in my years of training as an economist, and in particular as a macroeconomist, I never thought I'd say. And that is, I've described, certainly the early part of this as a desirable recession. It's a public health act as you describe it. So I mean, I guess we're still in the heart of it. So do you think we're still in this sort of desirable recession phase, as I would call it?
Yes, I think that it's putting the spotlight on us to think carefully about policy, but also very much about communication. So, there's been some lines of argument that, economists just kind of care about money and trade-offs, and that there's this kind of fight between the public health side and the economic side. And I think stepping back from that, that's not a good depiction at all of how economists think about this problem. We're thinking of the complementarity between the public health response and the economic response. So they're working together. And again, that's not, that's pushing us a little bit, but we are using the tools, but not sometimes the ones that just the ones that people immediately ascribe to us. Just think about the countries that have done really well in this crisis. They're the ones that have responded really well to the public health crisis. So through testing, tracing, supporting the self-isolation and so on. And that's allowed their economies to get back to work. So, we have to use economics in a way that's really helpful to the public debate. And I think, the pressure's on us in this crisis, as it was actually in the global financial crisis.
And just a sort of a one line response on that. I think probably the thing that I found most striking about this communication effort, as you describe it, is that everybody expected us, and many times the media have portrayed economics as a profession as sort of, we're pushing for no lockdown because we want the economy to do well, like this trade-off exists. But my experience, and I don't know if it accords with what you've sort of felt, my experience has been that economists have actually been the ones selling the nonsense of that trade-off, as you rightly said. So I'm quite proud of the response that economists have had. Of course, we could always do better, but it seemed to me, at least, that we have responded with trying to push this. Now, whether we've been successful, I guess, is another question.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that economists, many economists have helped the public debate, but I think it also reveals some of the kind of thinness of the understanding of economics in the media, as well as in the broader public. So, we have a job to do.
So that sort of brings me nicely onto my next sort of question, which is about, we're getting to the point where, do we think that economics will fare better in the court of public opinion than it did after the global financial crisis? Maybe because we're not both the source of the shock and, part of the response. But a sort of second part of that is, do you think it matters if we're popular? Like, if people understand us and we're popular, do you think that's important to us? Or should we, be unpopular at times and just work away in the background, feeling that we know we're doing the right thing? So where are you on this sort of popularity?
We should both be extremely self-critical, and we should really care about our ability to persuade people about relevant arguments. So if you think about the global financial crisis, then economists were really definitely in the doghouse in terms of extreme complacency in the period running up to the financial crisis, and being so happy that inflation targeting was going so well, and we seem to have kind of conquered volatility of business cycles. So everyone was kind of just sitting around. It was very boring teaching macro at that time. And we were super complacent, so nobody was noticing what was happening in the financial sector. And, there really was, looking back, there was really no excuse for it because it was there in the data. But we had removed teaching about balance sheets, for example. So nobody knew one end of a balance sheet from another. Nobody really knew how to think about the relationship between banks and the real economy. So we were definitely in the wrong at that stage. But I think sometimes we kind of forget that we're kind of squeezed between two bad episodes. So one episode was the complacency, and then there was a second episode which was definitely not the consensus of the profession, but it's often put on us, and that was the austerity episode. But in between, I think economists were fantastic. So economists really stepped up to the plate and took the lessons of the Great Depression, persuaded politicians to act really big and in a really timely fashion, and that prevented a second Great Depression. And unfortunately, I think that's sometimes kind of lost in the mist of time, even though 2008-9 isn't that long ago. But it was a really extraordinary episode of economic historians, economists analyzing data in real time, really persuading politicians about what they needed to do. And it was also a great example of cooperation between, international cooperation. So, so I think that was we looked good then, and we were doing good work.
at a time when, of course, everybody was struggling, so maybe it was hard to notice the sort of positive contribution. It's this classic question of, things were bad, and they were bad, but they could have been a lot worse. But that's very hard sell, right? To say we prevented it from being even worse when actually it was pretty terrible. And you don't necessarily get the credit for preventing the even worse outcome. I agree with that. I mean, it's been essentially a decade since that positive contribution, and I'm probably quite biased. It's been a decade that I've been in the profession as an academic. I was as a policymaker before that a bit. And I've seen lots of changes. I don't know if you're going to agree with that, but I think we've done quite a bit as a profession, and we've made quite a bit of progress. But I still think we have a lot to do. So how do you see the changes that we have already put in place since the financial crisis, and acknowledging that we're still in firefighting mode with regard to the COVID crisis? Do you kind of predict bigger changes as a result of the COVID crisis?
I think. I think there's quite a few aspects of that. It's kind of like a giant question. So I think you've got to think about the last 30 or 40 years of economics, and if we think about sort of academic economics, then it's made absolutely extraordinary steps forward, and the whole information and behavioral economics revolution has changed the way we conceive of how the economy works. So we think now that the way it works is through mainly through interactions that don't take place necessarily through markets, and so that's certainly not through complete contracting, and that's really is a revolution, because it allows us to introduce the role of social norms, of private power. It places inequality back into the center of economic thinking. And it also provides us with a really natural bridge between these kind of two camps of microeconomics and macroeconomics. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that in macroeconomics. It was earlier in micro, and it's really passed into macro, partly prompted by the financial crisis, where it was clearly impossible to ignore the difference between borrowers and lenders, for example. So we've moved into a world in which macroeconomics is populated by different actors in different power situations: employers, employees, lenders, borrowers. So we have these heterogeneous agent settings for models, and that's of course a precondition for talking about inequality. So I think there's been quite extraordinary progress in academic economics, and if people want to get a glimpse of that very quickly, and it's all open access, is to go to the Journal of Economic Perspectives and just scan that journal, which is written, all the articles are written in a way that are accessible to anyone. And just even looking at the titles for the last 3 or 4 years, you just get a vision of a profession focusing on many, not all as we'll come to, but on many of the central problems that we faced.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think sometimes because it's sort of at the academic frontier, this stuff hasn't necessarily filtered into what people perceive as economics. So in particular, I wonder, going back to the question about the court of public opinion, there's also the sort of court of politician or policymaker opinion. It's slightly less clear to me that the last decade has seen as much progress in our relationship there. We may have had more power or more influence while working on perhaps less appropriate or less relevant issues. So do you think we still have a lot of work to do on that battle?
Definitely. So the battle of trying to explain how the economy works. I mean, I think we're in the middle of this crisis. People everywhere are just really want to understand how the world works under these very peculiar circumstances, but even more widely. So I think there's immense curiosity, and I think that it's incumbent on us to kind of feed that curiosity by making accessible the new thinking about how the way the economy works, and that economics is just much broader than money and men in suits working in the city. That's not what economics is.
No, absolutely. So that's actually a nice segue. So Economics Observatory is obviously one way that we've tried to sort of bridge this gap. But a much older, long-running attempt to do so is the core project, the curriculum open access resources for teaching economics that you have been a sort of lead figure in, with others, of course. But for it must be a decade now that core has been going on.
No, you think that? No, we actually had our first meeting. We were launched at the Treasury on the 11th of November 2013.
Okay, so seven-year anniversary this year. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a sort of some sense of when you were conceiving this idea and you were preparing for that meeting in 2013? What vision you had, and how the eventual events have unfolded and shaped it into what it's become. So is it what you expected?
Yeah. So it's interesting because the very, very first meeting was at the beginning of that year in 2013. And what I did, I just called a very small meeting of about 12 people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the NBER. And I just contacted several people. Some of them I didn't know. Some of them I knew were writing textbooks. So, for example, Daron Acemoglu and David Leibson were there. There were some people from different countries and even from different disciplines. So Katerina Pistor, who's a legal theorist, but works on corporate governance, I asked her to come. And it was really just a very kind of open discussion about whether people thought something needed to be done. And out of that small meeting came a subgroup of people, maybe about 8 people who said, yes, okay, let's try and do something. And so we then assembled a much bigger group of researchers from around the world. So it's always been global. So it's a global collaboration. And it's always been people volunteering their time. So everyone working in the project has given their time to it. And to begin with, we just thought, oh, well, maybe we can just put together some reading lists or syllabus or something like that. And the idea that we had a sort of grand plan was absolutely not the case. We hadn't even heard of an ebook. So we had no idea about sort of publishing online or anything like that. But things happened very, very quickly. And we had a first interactive ebook in the classroom in 4 universities in 2014. So, that's quite remarkable to kind of galvanize a team of about 20 writers from around the world and have a text that reads with a single voice into the classroom, basically within a year. And then because it seemed to fill a gap, it was a very different way of teaching economics. We were starting from the big problems. So there's a really different approach. It's saying, what are the big problems that we face? And then step back from that, how do we use economic models to provide insight onto those problems? And obviously we need data. We also need models to simplify the problems and to provide us with some causal mechanisms that can then be tested with the data. So the standard approach is, well, you just teach a bunch of theory and you find a few applications. So this is more or less the other way around. You find the real problems and then you step back and build up the theory. So that's the starting point. So a new pedagogy, new content reflecting the last 30 or 40 years of the best of economics research, and then a new delivery mechanism, which is free online, open access, highest quality materials.
So I think the reason I thought it must be around 10 years old was because I remember being at Warwick and Robin Naylor coming to me, because I was teaching a first year course at the time, and coming to me, and he was teaching the micro side, and coming to me and saying, there's this new book, and it would have been around 2013, 14, and I had just worked out in my head that it must take 2 to 3 years at least
Yeah.
to get to that point. The fact that you went from sort of the NBER in July to a meeting at the Treasury in November to a book for the next year is phenomenal. And you know, that ebook is now a physical book, because I know I have it on my bookshelf. And the course,
yeah, and there are two of them. There are 2 physical books, and there's a third ebook. So we've also done a project called Economy, Society and Public Policy, and that's being used in master's courses in public policy, as well as in undergraduate courses for students who are not specializing in economics. So we've got that, and then there's the third one, which is called Doing Economics, and that's a set of empirical projects where students deal with real data, addressing real problems. They teach themselves essentially from scratch to use spreadsheets or R for data visualization and analysis. So that's the sort of portfolio that we've got at the moment.
Okay, so and before I ask you what's next, this is an opportune moment. One aspect of the profession that we are still working at is that of diversity along many dimensions, and of course one of the aims of CORE is to, you know, widen the interest in economics, and therefore, you know, encourage people into it, but maybe people who would have been naturally turned off by the old pedagogy.
Yeah.
And so you know, both within CORE but also perhaps more broadly, you know, how have you seen the efforts that economics has undertaken to increase sort of diversity along you know, many dimensions in the last 15 or 20 years? Where do you think we are on that journey, and what do we have left to do?
We have a huge amount left to do. So yes, this subject has been discussed for, well, as long as I can remember. Actually, people are always talking about the pyramid and the pipeline, and how we can get more women and underrepresented groups into economics. And you know, the question about why it matters, I think, is important to convey as well. And it matters because many economists go out there, work in policy or work in the public sector, and we need the ideas, we need the input, the participation of a much wider cross-section of society. And one of the ways that we've tried to do that in the project is, I think, captured by an exercise that we do every year, and we encourage teachers around the world to do every year with their beginning students. And they should start their very first encounter with their students with a blank screen, that all that it says is, what are the most pressing problems that economists today should be working on? And we did this first in 2014, and we were completely staggered by the results from our own students at UCL, many of whom are oriented towards careers in the financial sector, for example. But the overwhelmingly most common response was inequality. We built a word cloud based on that. They said inequality, financial instability, robots, development poverty. These the topics that came up most frequently. And if we showed it to someone else, so if I showed it to someone when I was in the Netherlands or somewhere, they'd say, oh, well, my students definitely won't say that. You know, that's, you know, your students maybe. But everywhere that this has been done around the world, we get the same kinds of results. And we've now got thousands and thousands of responses. But what's really striking in terms of the diversity question is that students coming into that first class, they're really exercised by these problems. And can we, you know, the question for us is, can we deliver? And it may well be that if students come into a course or even they're contemplating it and they don't think that that course is going to give them the tools to understand these problems, then they get turned off. And that may be disproportionately the case, for example, with women or with other groups. So I think there is a connection between content, pedagogy, and diversity. So we need to bring those together. to try to turn around this this pipeline problem.
Wendy, I'm going to wrap it up here, but you asked the sort of the key question there, you know, on that issue. Can we deliver? Let me just say, I feel all the more confident that we can deliver with you continuing to sort of push forward on the core side and as a sort of as one of the leaders in our profession. And so thank you very much for sort of giving us your opinion today and sharing your views on a diversity of things that we sort of face as challenges, both in terms of policy, but also for ourselves as a profession. And yeah, fingers crossed we can enter a much more relaxed time where a bit more normality can face us, and we can sort of work on pushing some of these ideas forward. But Wendy Carlin, thank you very much for your contributions today. Thanks.
It's a pleasure, and it's a great time to be an economist. So we hope you'll join us.
Yeah. Thanks, Wendy.